Greetings, everybody. This is the third Monday in January, which is where we traditionally celebrate the birthday of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His birthday is actually January 15th, but in the United States here, we celebrate it as a national holiday on every third Monday in January. This is a wonderful day, and I want to encourage all of you to do something in honor and in memory of the life and the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The reason for this video, this is sort of one of my few efforts to honor him and with regard to his memory, and actually to share a few of my own memories of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's life before and after his assassination there in Memphis. So let me just share this first of all. But the most important thing in Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life after his family was his ministry. He was certainly well known as a civil rights leader and an actor in the civil rights movement. In fact, one of the things he said about himself was that when people remember him, that they should remember that he was a foot soldier for justice. That's a great thing to be able to say. But I'll tell you something, for those of us who lived in the South and who grew up listening to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s recorded speeches and primarily his sermons, some of them just recorded like from church in the late 1960s, from his, from his sermons and things on radio stations across the South. What we remembered was his presentation of the gospel, because what he primarily was a minister and a pastor and a preacher. In fact, I personally refer to him as America's prophet. So here he is with in this family photo that I really like, with his wife, Coretta Scott King, his sons and daughter, Dexter King, Martin Luther King III, and Yolanda King. They are sitting next to Mom. Beautiful picture. It's one that we don't commonly see of him. We forget that he was actually both a man and a family man, a human being with family concerns and personal concerns and life concerns. We've sort of made him bigger than life, and the pictures that we show of him are often of him standing, in front of some, pulpit or in some structured environment. Those are all great, but I like this picture because it shows him as a person with his family. That's a very rare shot. The thing that I want to make sure to share with all of you, what does this have to do with the Silicon Valley Black Chamber of Commerce and our drive for education and for better employment and for business access? Well, here is the point. Prior to Martin Luther King's death, prior to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, his goal that he was pursuing, his last and what he called the final leg of what he called his drive for civil rights, was economic justice. And that's not economic justice as we call it today, with reparations and those kinds of things. What he referred to as economic justice was giving businesses and individuals who wanted to start businesses, or those in employment situations, giving them access to the full range of government, business, and economic services in order to do their jobs, in order to get an education, in order to get adequate housing, in order to even get access to capital with banks and financial institutions. All of these were restricted in the 1960s. I mean, in the years prior to that, there were certain banks you could not go to. In fact, there were a majority of banks that many people who were Black wanting to start a business could not go to, or were not allowed to engage, couldn't get loans, even if they were allowed to bank there. And that really didn't, the amount of money they actually had in the bank was almost of no consequence. They could not get a business loan, could not get a home loan, in fact, here's an easy example. My grandfather's home was in the Negro Estates area of Oklahoma City. It was the one place where Black people in Oklahoma City were allowed to buy homes. The deed to his home actually says that. Negro Estates at the lowest rates was what the motto on the document on the deed said. You can believe that. So, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was engaged in efforts to address those kinds of problems, address those kinds of issues in society. The really bad news is many Black leaders in quite a few states, including apparently Oklahoma and Kansas, places like that, were against him, were against his efforts to bring economic equality to their communities, to their homes, and to their neighborhoods and to their states. In Memphis, he wasn't necessarily involved. The event there, the garbage worker strike, wasn't necessarily a Black event. We tend to think of everything Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was involved in as a Black event. Well, actually, he was involved in a number of global events and human rights and social and civil rights events around the globe, in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, obviously Vietnam. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was very much focused on driving opportunities for Black businesses and really non-white businesses in general to be able to get access to loans, to grants, to financial support, financial assistance, financial services, even access to the means of starting or supporting or building a business. Even today, in many American cities, the platforms by which you can start a business, or the documents and details and services by which you can start a business, are located in everywhere in many cities except in Black communities. That's or Hispanic communities. And so Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King drove those issues, but they again were not his main focus. They are just the focus of what we are discussing today. It's important to remember that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a reverend, and he was a minister of the gospel. All of the ideas that he presented, he had been discussing all of his life with his family, with his wife, with instructors and teachers and advisors, with regard to how the gospel should be applied to business, how the gospel should be applied to driving equality in employment and housing and in the economic system. So his last sphere of focus was improving the economic situation, the economic environment for businesses of color, and primarily Black business in America. That was what he was doing when he attended the Memphis garbage workers strike. The garbage workers weren't necessarily all Black. They were actually predominantly white. But the situation was such that working conditions and health conditions for them were abominable. And if you can imagine, the white garbage workers actually had good working conditions and healthcare services and support, as opposed to the Black workers. But in all truth, the situation for all of them was bad. And they invited him to come and speak and basically publicize their situation. That's the kind of person Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was. It wasn't necessarily a Black fight or a Black thing for him. It was exactly as he stated in his I Have a Dream speech. Here's a portion that you don't often hear people say, and that is, I have a dream that one day America, this nation, will live up to the true meaning of its creed, that all men are created equal, that everyone is created equal. That is what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was about. And that wasn't just something that we threw into the Constitution historically. That was something that was stated in Scripture, that should be our stand as a nation, as a culture, as a society, certainly as human beings, and most definitely as Christians. So I hope that helps give some perspective. And another thing that I think about often is how my father, our families, we drove back and forth across the South, spanning from Texas to Florida, where he would go onto plantations, where we would drive onto plantations and to sort of Black communities on large scale white-owned properties and estates, and preach in their little churches, their little makeshift churches that the landowners would set up for them, or that they would build themselves. And he would preach, and they would pay or give him whatever they could afford. And very often he was discouraged from talking about economic independence, economic growth, self-help, self-development in those communities and in those towns. So much so that if he spoke on that kind of subject, my father would not get paid by the landowners and the property owners that who had contracted with him to drive this circuit, to preach to their, let's call them, to their people, every once in a while, to provide them ministry services. And so but he did it anyway. Actually, he was one of those types. My father was one of those types. And even though they would warn him, don't preach to them about independence, don't preach to them about self-help, don't preach to them about starting their own businesses or being self-atomized, he would do it anyway. And that was not just because he felt like, disobeying some direct order from a sharecrop landowner, but it was part of the gospel, very much as Martin Luther King did. And so as we would drive across the states and into these small towns and onto these plantations, we would hear on Black radio stations and actually on some white radio stations across the South, the recordings of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's sermons. Some of them recently given the day before or the week prior. And this again was both before his death and after. So, there was a program that I remember called Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Speaks. Very popular program. I heard it in my teenage years as I traveled with my parents and even with other music organizations as a performer and those kinds of things. But that's a whole nother story. The point is that the goal that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. drove in his last days was one of economic equality in terms of the ability to build a business, to drive your own employment and professional future, to drive, and not just starting with graduating high school and sort of getting a job, but actually having the perspective of pursuing your own business, pursuing self-development opportunities, even if you had no high school education at all. That was the idea, to promote in people the vision to develop themselves, to pursue their own dreams, their own goals, in all truth, no matter what color they were, no matter what color they are. Today, that's our drive in the Silicon Valley Black Chamber of Commerce and in the Center for Entrepreneurial Development. That's our goal, is to drive that effort very much as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did. So as you're thinking about celebrating the holiday, please consider the possibilities, opportunities that present themselves in 2022 for starting your own business, for improving your professional career and opportunities, and for maybe getting additional education that will help you do both, because the services and opportunities for access are there. Thanks for listening. Sam Washington, Silicon Valley Black Chamber of Commerce. Join us. Visit us. Visit our website. Contact me directly. But either way, we would look forward to partnering and sharing with you. Thanks so much.